All right. So you've been digging into all this stuff about President Trump's second term and the immigration policies, specifically like all the increased deportations focused on Nigerians and other Africans. We've got some like really interesting pieces here to look at today, including some excerpts from a policy analysis and even a couple of firsthand accounts.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really complicated issue.
Right. Like with lots of moving parts.
Totally.
Okay, so to set the scene, Trump's second term started back on January 20th, 2025. And it seems like we're seeing, a pretty noticeable shift in immigration enforcement across the board. The administration is making some pretty bold moves, ramping up ICE operations and potentially adjusting policies around detention and stuff. So what exactly are these potential adjustments and how do they actually compare to previous approaches to immigration enforcement?
Well, it seems like one of the key shifts is they're expanding the criteria for detaining undocumented immigrants. So potentially that's going to make it easier to, hold individuals while they're waiting for those deportation proceedings to happen.
Okay.
And in the past, detention was usually reserved for, people who pose a security risk or were considered a flight risk. Like they might run away.
Right.
But with this broader approach, it could significantly increase the number of people stuck in detention centers.
Yeah.
Which obviously that raises a whole bunch of questions, logistical questions about capacity and just ethical questions about conditions and things like that.
Absolutely. And we're already seeing the impacts of this in Nigeria and across the whole continent of Africa, basically. One of the most immediate consequences outlined in this analysis is the disruption of those remittances, the money being sent back home. And they're estimating this could lead to a 15% drop in remittances to Nigeria alone, which is huge, potentially pushing tens of thousands of families below the poverty line.
Right. Yeah. And the economic impact of this is it's significant for sure because remittances are such a vital part of so many African economies. It's not even just individual families who rely on this income. We're talking about small businesses that rely on that money and community development projects and stuff. It's really a lot.
Totally. And it's not just the financial hit, right? There's so much more to it than that. One of the firsthand accounts we have is actually from this Nigerian man who was deported after living in the U.S. for over 10 years.
Wow.
And he talks about this intense stigma he faced when he got back home. The difficulty in finding work and just this overall sense of displacement. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, reintegration after something like that is incredibly challenging, because so many of these deportees, they built their whole lives in the U.S. So when they get sent back, they might have very limited connections in their home countries. And they can face a lot of difficulty finding employment, especially given the economic realities in many parts of Africa.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And this kid also mentions how, his deportation really strained his relationship with the family members who studied in the U.S., both emotionally and financially. It seems like these policies kind of create these, ripple effects that go way beyond just the individual being deported.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's potential strain on U.S.-Africa relations, too, right?
Exactly. That's what I was just going to ask you about. So what about that aspect of it? What do you think about that potential strain?
Well, the analysis kind of suggests that it could become a major point of friction between the two. We could see African leaders kind of pushing back against U.S. aid or even existing trade agreement.
Oh, wow.
And, it also has the potential to complicate security cooperation, especially in areas where the U.S. relies on African partners to combat terrorism or other transnational threats. All that stuff could be thrown off.
Totally. Okay, so kind of switching gears a little bit, thinking more about the impact here in the United States now, what really stood out to you about the potential labor market effects? The analysis highlights how African immigrants are kind of disproportionately represented in those essential sectors like healthcare and tech. So could this lead to shortages down the line or impact, the quality of care that people are receiving?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we're actually already seeing, workforce shortages in a lot of healthcare professions.
Right.
So a large-scale deportation of African immigrants, especially because so many of them are, nurses or doctors or home health aides, that could definitely, make those shortages even worse. It could put a lot of extra strain on the healthcare system as a whole.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's also this report from a community organizer in Chicago. Yeah. And they're raising concerns about heightened community tensions and even potential protests in response to, all the increased ICE activity. What sort of historical parallels can we draw here, do you think? Have we seen this kind of thing before?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
throughout U.S. history, immigration crackdowns have almost always been met with, some kind of resistance, especially from immigrant communities and their allies.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it with the Sanctuary City movement back in the 1980s, and also with the protests against Arizona's SB 1070 law in the 2010s. And these types of policies often, they tap into some really deep-seated anxieties.
Yeah.
And that can definitely lead to, some social unrest.
So absolutely. And the analysis also talks about the whole resource allocation issue too. Like they're estimating that a 20% increase in ICE's budget would be needed to fully implement all of these new policies, which could potentially divert resources from other important areas.
Yeah. So, what kind of trade-offs are we actually talking about here?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? Because that increased funding for ICE could end up coming at the expense of other domestic programs, right? Like education or healthcare or infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it raises a lot of questions about the opportunity costs involved here. Like, are we really investing in the most effective and humane approaches to, managing immigration overall? That's something we have to think about.
Okay, so we've definitely covered a lot of ground today. And it's clear that these deportation policies have, the potential to create some serious ripple effects, across economies, within communities, and even impacting international relations. It's pretty intense. So given all of the potential impacts that we've talked about, what alternative approaches to immigration could address those concerns about undocumented residents, but at the same time, minimize all of the potential negative consequences?
It's a tough question, I know, but I think it's something worth, thinking about as all of this continues to unfold. I totally agree. It's definitely something we need to be paying attention to.
For sure. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We'll be back next week with another look at this ever-changing world. Thanks for tuning in.
See ya!